A second hazard facing mass movements is the NGOization of resistance. It'll be easy to twist what I'm about to say into an indictment of all NGOs, but that would be a falsehood. In the murky waters of fake NGOs set up to siphon off grant money, or as tax dodgers, in states like Bihar, they're given as dowry. Of course, there are NGOs doing valuable work, but it's important to consider the NGO phenomenon in a broader context. In India, for instance, the funded NGO boom began in the late 1980s and early 1990s. It coincided with the opening of India's markets to neoliberalism. At the time, the Indian state, in keeping with the requirements of structural adjustment, was withdrawing funding from rural development, agriculture, energy, transport, and public health. As the state abdicated its traditional role, NGOs moved in to work in these very areas. The difference, of course, is that the funds available to them are a minuscule fraction of the actual cut in public spending. Most large funded NGOs are financed and patronized by aid and development agencies, which are in turn funded by Western governments, the World Bank, the UN, and some multinational corporations. Though they may not be the very same agencies, they are certainly part of the same loose political formation that oversees the neoliberal project and demands the slash in government spending in the first place. Why should these agencies fund NGOs? Could it just be old-fashioned missionary zeal? Guilt? It's a little more than that. NGOs give the impression that they're filling the vacuum created by a retreating state. And they are, but in a materially inconsequential way. Their real contribution is that they diffuse political anger and dole out as aid or benevolence what people ought to have by right. NGOs alter the public psyche. They turn people into dependent victims and blunt the edge of political resistance. They form a sort of buffer between the sarkar and the public, between empire and its subjects. They have become the arbitrators, the interpreters, the facilitators. In the long run, NGOs are accountable to their funders, not to the people they're working amongst. They're what botanists would call an indicator species. It's almost as though the greater the devastation caused by neoliberalism, the greater the outbreak of NGOs. Nothing illustrates this more poignantly than the phenomenon of the US preparing to invade a country and simultaneously readying NGOs to go in and clean up the devastation. In order to make sure their funding isn't jeopardized and that the governments of the countries they work in will allow them to continue to function, NGOs have to present their work in a shallow framework, more or less shorn of a political or historical context, at any rate an inconvenient political or historical context. Apolitical, and therefore extremely political, distress reports from poor countries and war zones eventually make the dark people of these dark countries seem like pathological victims. Another malnutritioned Indian, another starving Ethiopian, another Afghan refugee camp, another maimed Sudanese in need of the white man's help. They unwittingly reinforce racist stereotypes and reaffirm the achievements, the comforts, and the compassion, the tough love of Western civilization. They're the secular missionaries of the modern world. But eventually, on a smaller scale, but more insidiously, The capital available to NGOs plays the same role in alternative politics as the speculative capital that flows in and out of the economies of poor countries. It begins to dictate the agenda. It turns confrontation into negotiation. It depoliticizes resistance. It interferes with local people's movements that have traditionally been self-reliant. NGOs have funds that can employ local people who might otherwise be activists in resistance movements, but now can feel they're doing some immediate creative good and earning a living while they're at it. Real political resistance offers no such shortcuts. The NGOization of politics threatens to turn resistance into a well-mannered, reasonable, salaried 9-to-5 job with a few perks thrown in. But real resistance has real consequences and no salary.